My name's Stephen King. I'm a student at the University of Toronto. I'm filming a documentary for my Earth Sciences class. The topic is CO2 emissions and global warming, and solutions. When I embarked on this project, I didn't realize the scope and the depths of climate change and how it affects people and polarizes and politicizes everyone. We visited North America's biggest polluter for decades. We went to Ottawa to see what the man on the street had to say. We interviewed scientists at the University of Toronto. And in doing so, we realized just how complex this issue is. It seemed that if we were going to look at climate change, we should go right to the source, find the biggest polluters. So we did. We went to Nanticoke. 4 of this massive station's 8 generators have been retired, but we still burn the 4 in peak times. The McGuinty government has just announced that the conversion of the Thunder Bay plant from coal to natural gas will not proceed, as well as the construction of 2 natural gas plants, one in Brampton and one in Mississauga, being removed from Ontario Power Generation's future plans. With our economy growing and energy needs constantly rising, not just in Ontario, but worldwide, it brings to the forefront, where are we going to get our power? Are we going to rely on our old ways of burning coal? The dirtiest way of making power.
The current model is that climate change is blamed on the burning of fossil fuel, which pumps carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And we're talking here about coal, oil, and natural gas. Our ability to cut this back is almost non-existent. The international agreements that have been attempted over the last dozen-odd years have, in the first place, omitted China and other developing countries from any requirement for cutback. That was the nature of the Kyoto Protocol, for example. The Chinese were not required to do anything. And since then, there's been no international agreement on how to manage national emissions. Individual countries have made commitments, but in most cases they've not been able to meet these commitments, because usually industrial progress, economic expansion, has increased the use of fossil fuels faster than attempts to improve efficiency in use and substitute other energy sources has been able to cut back in carbon emissions. So it's a problem that we really are not coming to grips with at all at this point in time.
If we are to convince the developing world to follow a different path towards a more sustainable future, then we're going to have to help them a great deal by providing them with the technology that will allow them to supply the energy to their societies, which is required for development, in a form that is much less damaging to the environment than is the burning of fossil fuels, especially coal.
Coal is probably the biggest problem in this regard, because coal-fired power plants are very widespread. We're cutting back on the use of coal to some extent now in North America by substituting natural gas for coal and by cleaning up some of the older coal-fired power plants. But in the third world, particularly China and other growing economies, coal is still the cheapest, quickest way to generate new power, and so it's being used in a very widespread way.
Every 10 days, China begins construction on a new coal-fired power plant. Now, what's wrong with the old way of making power? And what other realistic alternatives do we actually have?
To solve the CO2 emission problem, then you have to put in low or non-CO2 emitting techniques for major electrical power generation. So, of course, there is significant and successful experimentation with wind power, particularly going to offshore wind power in jurisdictions like Denmark and Scotland. Solar power in jurisdictions like southern Spain and the southwest United States. And probably, if these solutions are taken seriously, then, as far as one can see, nuclear power will be an inevitable method of solving the CO2 emission problem.
Each of the different modes of sustainable energy production really live in different geographical spaces, if you like. For example, it's really not possible to power portions of the planet in which sunlight is rare using photovoltaic cells. Similarly, it's not possible to power those parts of the planet using wind energy if the wind doesn't blow sufficiently strongly. So what we're looking forward to, I think, in the future is the development and use of a mix of alternative and sustainable energy sources which are matched to the environment in which they're employed.
Before we go any further, we thought we should probably see, do we really have a problem? Are these climate change models accurate? And do we need further scientific discussion and assessment of these climate change models? Because there seem to be cooling off periods, both in the 1960s and in 1998.
The warmest summer we've had on record globally occurred in 1998. And there has been little warming since then. A few records have been broken, but by and large the trends suggest that there's been little or no warming since 1998. And 1998 was characterized by a very powerful El Nino effect, and it's quite likely that a lot of the extreme conditions that we experienced that year were in fact related to El Nino and not to long-term climate trend.
The interpretation that I've read about the plateau, and the numbers fit approximately, is that the sun went into a period of global activity minimum, and that counterbalanced the steady increase in global warming. Interestingly, then the sun rather slowly came out of the solar minimum, and there was a prediction that 2012 would be one of the hottest years on record. That prediction included the effect of solar max, and it turned out to be correct. Very interestingly, next year, 2013, is also predicted to be one of the hottest world years on record, because there is a combination of steady global warming, an El Nino year, which has just been picked up, and El Ninos generate higher global average temperatures, and a subdued, continued high level of solar activity. So if the science is being properly understood, then you can make predictions, and then we find out if the predictions are right or wrong. And the current prediction is that 2013 will be one of the hottest measured years on record. We will see. The scientific hypotheses will be tested.
Unless you do sufficient averaging in time in order to get at the secular variation which lies beneath the natural variability, you'll be led to all sorts of spurious conclusions about the rate of global warming slowing down and so on and so forth. It's just that the internal variability is so strong that without taking it fully into account, you're liable to be led to conclusions which are really quite misleading.
We realized quickly that scientific opinions vary greatly on this subject. And I'm no scientist, so I wanted to talk to the men on the street, see what they had to say. We thought we'd go to Ottawa, the nation's capital, the belly of the beast, right to Parliament Hill, where all the decisions are made.
Although I note that the coverage of Hurricane Sandy last week in the U.S. certainly featured it prominently.
Indeed, yeah.
You know, it's not. I don't think anybody's proposing any reasonable solutions, and with the Harper government's continuous harping on this carbon tax thing, it's pretty depressing, really. I think if you're somebody who does care about the issue.
Well, I think it's pretty surprising when you think of what just happened in New York with Hurricane Sandy. You know, so I think at some point we're going to have to think about it, but it's difficult when we suddenly have a financial recession, other things suddenly come to the front of everybody's mind. So it's going to come back again.
Well, I think we're getting so used to the climate change that we're just kind of adapting to it, and you know, I'm part of the young population you're talking about there. Yeah. So you know, I wasn't really around when it started happening, shocking people. It's just been a topic for so long. It's kind of gotten into a lull, I guess.
Yeah, you hear something so much, it's, you know,
old news.
Yeah.
Definitely, I still talk about it with my family. It's just more about history, and that we grew up walking in tons of snow and going skating on ponds, and those same ponds don't even freeze up anymore. So it's definitely still a topic in friends and family.
Right, yeah. Well, do you think we should be doing more sort of in here about this? Yeah. So it's not off the radar?
Not off my radar.
Not off your radar?
I think it's dropped off the radar because we've got so many other things to worry about now. Yeah. I think people aren't so interested in that now, and they've got, you know, making ends meet, losing their jobs and stuff like that.
We asked people in Ottawa what they thought of electric cars, their feasibility, and if they could be a real solution to reducing CO2 emissions.
Well, I think it's you know, a good idea. I'm not sure that the technology is quite there yet. You know, we've got problems with good battery technology, and so I think probably we need to look at other solutions. You know, maybe more public transport and just otherwise cutting back.
Yeah.
They're, you know, part of might be called fringe, but you start to see those fueling stations popping up in Toronto and places like that. You know, we don't see it much in our end, Sarnia. It's not sort of a feasible technology where people can rely on them, I don't think, on a daily basis. But when push comes to shove and fossil fuels start to rise in price and global warming sort of continues to take hold, it'll probably have to be one of those initiatives we rely on. Sure, like solar and wind power and everything else.
I suppose it could be. The problem, I think, is the battery technology, isn't it? They weigh a ton and take up a lot of space. But if improvements are made in that area, then sure, I suppose it could be. Of course, we generate most of our power in Canada through carbon-intensive means.
Fossil fuels, yeah.
Exactly.
Electric vehicles in no way solve the CO2 emission problem unless the actual primary sources of electricity generation are themselves clean. If they are simply hydrocarbons like gas and coal in particular, high density oils from tar sands, as you correctly say, that doesn't solve any problem whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean the issue of you know, widespread use of electric automobiles, of course, has been in play for decades now. You may know that GM very early on was a strong proponent of electric vehicles, and all of their early production was in fact taken off the road basically by opposition of the fossil fuel industry, which liked very much the fact that its cars were being powered by fossil fuels. Of course, as the cost of gasoline has continued to rise, the motivation for moving again towards electric vehicles has increased enormously.
In the recent 2012 presidential debates between Mitt Romney and President Obama, it seemed that neither candidate wanted to discuss the environment whatsoever. I wanted to find out why.
It wasn't a big topic because, it took a side saddle to the economy, and it only came in at least it only came in with the green jobs in the American debates. It was the only way that anything environmental came in. So it really hasn't been one of the big topics that they've been going after.
Right, yeah. It's funny, when the jobs are at stake, that's the focus.
Right.
Yeah. Are you happy with Obama getting back in?
We are very happy about it. We obviously are. He at least has more of a focus on, creating environmentally friendly policies and moving us forward in that way. Certainly better than the alternative. So,
What about our guy?
We are still learning a lot about your guy. We only here.
Yeah, we're still learning too. Nobody knows what he's doing in there. It's a big mystery.
Yes, climate change is no longer a subject for serious discussion by political leaders anywhere, and this is certainly the case with the current presidential debates in the United States. And this is, I think, because politicians are simply looking at the poll numbers and they're realizing that climate change is no longer a top-of-mind issue. It was perhaps 10, 15 years ago when all sorts of promises were made, and that's when the Kyoto Protocol was signed. But it's subsequently, of course, been the case that the collapse of the economy, the worry about jobs and people's future has taken over as leading concerns of the general public. So there are no votes to be gained from a discussion about climate change. So if you happen to be on the left wing and you worry about climate change, what you would need to be talking about is more government spending and more government restrictions, which of course is unpopular. If you are on the other side of the debate, you would be talking about less government restriction and free the economy to do its own thing. And you would lose certain votes for concerned people on that side of the political equation as well. So there is nothing to be gained from bringing up climate change and introducing it into a discussion now. And that's why it's essentially not being talked about at all.
This is really an issue that the political class in the U.S. during the election wants to avoid at all costs. It really doesn't want to talk about this issue. It is a highly polarizing issue in the U.S. between Republicans and Democrats. I think it's really brings to the fore the enormous difference between the approach of Europe to the climate change issue and the approach of America. And ultimately, this is all about industrial and economic competition. No one community wishes to see itself put at an economic disadvantage by virtue of adopting policies which, although they would be of great benefit to the world at large, happen to put themselves at a disadvantage. So the Europeans seem to have managed this very much better than we have done here in North America on both sides of the border. Our current government in Canada is very loath to engage actually in the global warming debate. In fact, everything it has said sends a very clear message that it is not only not fond of discussing the global warming issue, but wishes to avoid it at all costs. The same basically approach that's being taken south of the border.
So in the North American jurisdiction, it seems that there's political apathy. It seems as though we will be burning fossil fuels for decades to come. So how will we have to adapt? And is adaptation the way forward?
So the way I look at things is from the point of view of what will happen over a 20, 50, 100-year time frame, and how will national jurisdictions of all their various kinds, how will they adapt? And what will be the responses of lucky jurisdictions compared with unlucky jurisdictions? So I first started to see the importance of planning for adaptation in science magazines about 3-4 years ago. And now I more fully understand why people are considering adaptation. Whether people like it or not, maybe that's going to be the future.
Being such a complex and complicated problem with many obstacles and roadblocks in the way, just what are some of the solutions that we can look for here?
Solutions? I think we need to do geoengineering in the short term. But in the long term, we definitely need to cut consumption.
I think that Mother Nature takes care of herself, and not a whole lot we can do to change it, hurt it, make it better.
It's a big rock.
It is. It absolutely is.
You think it'll be just fine?
I think we're going to be just fine.
I think so too.
What's the problem, guys?
No, there's no problem.
So why did global warming become climate change? When they released all those emails in London, faking all the statistics?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Right. ClimateGate.
ClimateGate.
ClimateGate. Right.
What about
no
that?
one talks about that anymore.
I don't know.
The whole issue's dropped off the map.
It should.
It should. There you go.
Well, again, just some of the people that we're leaning to are people like the David Suzuki Foundation and so on that give some of the local initiatives like the local organic foods that you buy from the farmers market as opposed to going to the grocery store. Riding your bike to work, mass transit. So those are all easy things that sort of the average person can do. But I think all in all, you're going to have to make it economically beneficial and cost effective for people to make choices that are not going to cost them a lot of money. So, I mean, gasoline's expensive, but it still hasn't driven too many people to subways and buses and their bicycles yet. So at some point, it's going to have to be an economic decision that forces people to be more environmentally responsible, I think.
Well, I mean, since there's no agreement, among the countries of the international community as a whole, this set of countries being a strong mix of those which are greatly advantaged by virtue of their early industrialization through the burning of coal, basically, and those which have not to date been able to industrialize in a similar fashion. There is huge polarization between developed and undeveloped. We used to speak of a north-south gradient. It's now, I think, no longer quite so clearly a north-south gradient as it is a rich-poor gradient. And of course, the wealthy countries continue to invest in attempts to help the poorer countries along a sustainable development path, but there are clearly limits to the willingness of the wealthy countries to make these investments. And what is clearly required, I think, in the future is to raise our game in terms of the extent to which the more advantaged, highly developed countries are willing to aid those less well-developed countries, which are now on a path to development themselves, to do so in a more sustainable fashion. How we accomplish this, of course, is a real issue.
We need to discuss what's actually happening with the climate. And the problem is that the climate science is an extraordinarily complex science. I mean, it involves aspects of meteorology, physics, chemistry, oceanography, earth sciences, and it's almost impossible for any one scientist to be fully knowledgeable and understanding of all aspects of climate science. So it means the debate is usually very, very partial.
It's almost become as though people's personal responses almost seem to play a role as to whether they're kind of optimistic kind of people or pessimistic kind of people. I began to think that I didn't really want to be either an optimist or a pessimist from that perspective, but to actually try to think about, given the last 20 years of history in the world, what do I think is actually going to happen? And what are the implications of what's actually going to happen? And, you have really different jurisdictions, running all the way, for example, from Bangladesh, India, all of that area, and two jurisdictions like Canada and Scandinavia, all of Africa. What's actually going to happen in all these jurisdictions? And if I were to say something at the end, then it would be something along these lines, I guess. And that is, there are already lucky jurisdictions and unlucky jurisdictions. So a very interesting personal question, and also a question, for example, for the federal government of Canada at the present time, is what do people intend to do who are in the lucky jurisdictions, and Canada is one of them? What do they intend to do about the people who are in the unlucky jurisdictions? I think that's a really fundamental question, and I wish that question had a bit more airing at the federal political level at the present time. Yeah.
While examining this complex issue of CO2 emissions and climate change, I quickly discovered that without open communication, solutions would be difficult to attain, at least in North America. With the lobbyists from the fossil fuel companies applying constant pressure, and our government's reliance on tax revenue from petroleum, natural gas, and electricity, it seems unlikely that this issue will be discussed at any political level anytime soon. And with political and scientific focus elsewhere, the climate change debate in North America appears to have truly fallen off the radar. Why then have the European countries been more successful in converting to more sustainable energy solutions? The answer could shed some light on our own inability to open any real dialogue on important issues. In Europe, when people rise up to voice concerns about pressing issues, they can shut the country down. They impose widespread labor strikes and hold massive protests in the streets. In short, the governments in Europe fear and respect the people. In Canada, people fear the government, for good reasons. When Canadians actually tear themselves away from their iPhones and Blackberries long enough to muster up the willpower to speak out about important political issues, as was the case in the G20 protests, in government-sanctioned free speech zones, they were beaten down by police forces and thrown in makeshift detention centers, with our rights and freedoms hanging precariously in the balance. In embarking on this massive capitalist experiment, we've somehow allowed our governments to become pawns to lobbyists and special interest groups, at times turning their backs on the people they're supposed to be protecting. And in doing so, we've traded some of our moral values for profitability. Until we reassess how we deal with each other, how we deal with our governments, how we deal with the politicization of important social issues, real solutions will likely be difficult to come by.